Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jeremy Ellis, host of Justice for the 110 podcast. Extremely excited again about today's guest, who is no stranger to the podcast network. We have Mr. Jim, if that's okay if I call you Jim Delgado, who is the Senior Vice President, Exploration Sector Leader for Search, Inc. Also, author, and the reason I have him on today's show, co-author of the History and Archaeology of the Last Slave Ship Clotilda, which I had an opportunity to read, courtesy of Jim and Stacy. First, let me just say thank you all for the book. But I had the opportunity to read, and we want to discuss that today. So, how are you doing today, Jim?
Doing good, and good to see you again.
Good to see you again. And again, just thank you as always for your willingness to speak with this audience, those interested in the story of the 110 survivors and those that are in the Africatown community, to kind of just continue to share your expertise around Clotilda and what you all have been able to do in conjunction with Alabama Historical Commission. And just for transparency, we will be also interviewing Stacy from the Alabama Historical Commission. She's agreed. And we're going to focus as also on the book, but more from the Alabama Historical Commission's perspective. So, yeah, let's just jump right into it. When you wrote this particular book, because I found it interesting, it seems like there's a particular audience. There's a group of people who you were writing for and writing to. But who was the target audience when you initially wrote this latest book?
It's an interesting question, because I wasn't really thinking so much about a target audience as much as trying with the others to take the reports that we'd done throughout the entire process of all the forensic and archaeological work on the river and make it a little less report and more of a narrative, and to share that with folks. Part of that process is, of course, publishing, and we chose an academic publisher for a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of interest out there, and in particular, as you and I both know, there have been questions about, well, is it really Clotilda? And that started at the very beginning, particularly with all the number of searches and false starts that went back for decades. So academic press with peer review, adding on top of the peer review from the reports, was important, but also then to get it out to other archaeologists, other historians and scholars, but also to make it accessible so that it wasn't mired down in all of the, every name of every bacteria that lives in the river and has an influence on wood, as opposed to making it accessible for people who wanted to know more. And in that, to have a book that also focused on the history, on the ship itself and its maritime context, which is nowhere near as important as the human context, but just the same as an aspect of the story that had not been told and needed to be there for a more complete body of scholarship and also as part of the narrative.
Absolutely. You definitely start the book off giving context to the origins, the history, but then also you start off talking about 1BA 694. I definitely want to get into these naming conventions, but tell us about 1BA 694 and how that got you all involved in what would ultimately be identifying the correct ship, 1BA 704. But kind of just talk about 1BA 694, how that kind of got you all involved in the search.
Well, as you may recall, the news story broke saying that Clotilda had likely been found there at the confluence of the Spanish and the Mobile rivers, close to 12 Mile Island, and a lot of excitement ensued. as some surprise as well. And I hadn't really gained a full sense of that surprise until I read Nick Tabor's book, by the way, though I had already known, of course, that
Excellent book. He's been on the podcast. I don't know if
yeah,
you know that or not, but Nick
yeah.
did an awesome job with his book as well.
Yeah. So in that, with the surprise and knowing that the Slave Wrecks Project and others had just been on the brink of coming out to do a survey, got the call and was asked to come on out and take a look. One of the reasons that sites have numbers is that more often than not, we don't know a name. And I guess that goes back to an old scientific convention. If you don't know the name of that an indigenous people gave to their settlement, or early site names, everything like the Three Rock site or things of that sort, that gets very confusing. A regular inventory with numbers works. And in the case of this one, coming back to shipwrecks, one of the toughest things to do in the world of shipwreck archaeology is what some of us refer to as pin the name on the wreck. Very rarely do you see the name of a ship actually on the wreck. Last week, 18,000 feet down with robotic cameras, we were able to see the name of the Japanese carrier Akagi, spelled out in hiragana, Akagi, paint on its stern, that had been sunk in the Battle of Midway. That's rare. In my career, you don't often see that. But with an unidentified wooden ship that is most likely, as we suspected, part of a mass-produced group of hundreds of these ships from World War I, you start with a number. And you may never get to a name. And to that end, I mean, we think it's the schooner Else. It's the logical candidate. But because it's a mass-produced ship, it's a very different thing. Because coming back to Clotilda, when we had to go through the, excuse me, coming back to Clotilda, when we had to go through the process of what does this wreck, what does 1BA704 represent? You may recall we talked about it. If it's a 57 Chevy that you're looking at in terms of a crime scene and a car involved in the crime, if it's a mass-produced vehicle, how do you know without the license plate that that's the one used? What we were able to determine with Clotilda was that it basically was a custom-built vessel that stood out from so many others.
Atypical is the word that you all used.
Yeah.
It was an atypical schooner.
Right.
You all did an excellent job throughout the book of actually debunking and verifying that it was Clotilda through the analysis, which I found that fascinating as a reader, for me. Well,
I think that for me, the one thing is you want to be really careful. I mean, this site, as we all know, is so incredibly important to the community, to the descendants, to telling the story, to history, that we needed to do our homework and have it checked and double checked and triple checked. And so again, 1BA704 was the number by which it was known and likely would still be known if we had not been able to say, yes, it's Clotilda.
How do they come up with these naming conventions? I was just curious about that. What is the rationale behind the numbers? Are they in some sort of sequential order?
Yes.
Okay.
And it depends. They basically, you'll have in each state, they'll have a number, they'll have a county, and then they'll have the number. So 1BA for Baldwin County, 704, goes in sequential order. But going back to, 45 years ago, one of the first archaeological sites I worked on was one SCL 57 in Santa Clara County, California, which was a site that dated back some 3,000 years. And we still talk about SCL 57. I think it's been since renamed SCL 125 because somebody resurveyed it later. But that system is nationwide. And it makes it easier for retrieving it. It's a really good tag or locator. And all I have to do is type in SCL 57, into my search engine on my computer, and voila, master's theses show up and all sorts of reports. Yeah, going back to when I was out there in 1972. Okay, there I said it. It was 50 years ago.
So these I was fascinated by the naming conventions because I didn't understand it, but now it's is actually tagged into my memory, and it'll make a great password because no one would ever guess it. But why? One of the things that stood out, a number of things stood out to me, and I'm going to take you through a different array. But I thought the book did a good job of some things, pointing out some things. So there were different things in the book that, for me, really just kind of drew my interest. And one of those was the area where 1BA 704, which is the target name, Clotilda was, for those that are listening and trying to learn what we're talking about, 1BA 704 is Clotilda, the ship. But that area had never been surveyed. All the other surrounding areas had been surveyed, but that one area which you all would kind of focus on would eventually be the area that you survey. But why was that area? Do we know why that area was never surveyed in the past?
There had been some confusion, and I think that confusion comes back to a point that I often find. It's very easy sometimes for people to assume that the landscape that surrounds us now is the way it's always looked.
Great point. Yeah, you pointed that out. Y'all pointed that out in the book very well.
So what people had forgotten is that all the old timers up through World War II knew that whole area as Bayou Canot. But by the 70s and 80s, when Jack Friend and others started really looking into this, that were just two other arms way up north. So that's where they looked. There's some interesting papers that belong to the mayors and to Jack Friend that are at the Mobile History Museum, and they talk about different areas. And there's one in Jack Friend's files where people said Clotilda might be, and there's a few that are actually down further south, but I think people dismissed those because it's got to be in Bayou Canot. But to the old timers, going back to the French period, hundreds of years ago, that was one big flooded area that was the bayou. And it's only over time, and particularly by the mid-19th century, that that landscape begins to change, primarily because the city had paid to help develop the port to put in rock-lined gabions to take the flow of the river and start to excavate a channel. And that led to creating sort of a bit of a draining and deepening the river, and led to forming what would ultimately today be called, for lack of a better term, the other side of the river as it branches around 12 Mile. But it was
so sorry to butt in, but are you saying that we know that the current landscape today is not what it looked like several years ago? So are we saying that that could be the reason why it might not have been surveyed, is because the landscape or that area wasn't, I don't know, able to be surveyed? Or I'm like, in layman's term, what would you?
In layman's terms, the modern landscape in the area where Clotilda rests was just considered part of the river as opposed to the bayou. But it was indeed the bayou way back then. But because the bayou's name had shifted to a whole other area, that's where all the early surveys went. But when you go back and look, and one of the things we did before we first showed up is we went back working with the state and we looked at everything on the map that had been surveyed. And that had already been done because the Slave Wrecks Project and the National Park Service had already done the same type of homework and knew that the area around 12 Mile Island had to be the area left to survey, that every other place had seen something that might or possibly could be, but didn't really work out. And really good people worked on all those surveys and did a real comprehensive job. But the last place left to look was there. And so that's where they had lined up the money and the support to come and do that. And working with Africatown were set to do it when all of a sudden 1BA 694 is found, or I should say, observed and posited to, possibly be Clotilda. That certainly then focused all that attention back on it. But for us, knowing all of that homework and coming out with a big thick binder with all that research, including the fact that that portion of the river hadn't even really been accurately surveyed. They'd only driven stakes in the mud to define the lines of what would become the river, and that had even shifted. We knew where a survey had to be done. And so with that, yes, what was interesting, and as you see in the book, finding that the Maritime Administration was still calling that area Bayou Canal in 1946 was like another aha moment.
What else was interesting in the book was so you read about, through my previous research, you read about how Mobile was one of the busiest ports in the world.
Yeah.
I think the fourth largest, busiest port in Southeast region, maybe, but it was definitely a area where a number of international ships would visit.
Yes.
There was one ship, it may have been, I don't know if it was Echo or something, but one of the ships was in Australia, and then it was over in the Mobile area. Can you just talk about Mobile and its involvement with being one of the busiest ports in the world at that time? Because I just think it helps with the context of why so many people were migrating to Mobile, in addition to the cotton boom, obviously, but Mobile was booming back then.
Well, it was booming, but again, coming back to the people side of the story.
Absolutely.
As I said early on, you know, and as we started talking, we wanted to put Clotilda within a maritime context. An aspect of that maritime context is the complicity with the institution of chattel slavery and the stealing of labor and taking of captives to work that cotton economy and to work that port. And so with that, I mean, we start with the French period in this to give the sense of here's a port, and a port that struggles until the eyes of the United States turn to it, dispossess the native indigenous people that are there through violence, introduce chattel slavery at a level never before seen, and build a massive factory system of plantations that is so powerfully demonstrated in that one map we included from the Coast Survey in 1860 that shows the percentage of people held in bondage with increasing, you know, by population density, with in some cases over 99% of the population in the county being held in bondage. All of that to feed that economy that harvests that cotton, sends it down the rivers along with other products, but not that many, and then loaded on ships that come to New Orleans as the major port, and then Mobile as the other, send that cotton north and to Europe to complicit partners in that trade. And so that port booms, and it gets all sorts of attention. But that's the context in which Clotilda is born, because that economy and the opportunity to be rich, whether you're running a steamboat or building a vessel to carry wood or lumber or working on those docks, it's all tied back to the core crime.
And all of these international ships are coming also for the lumber and for the cotton, and thinking about the enslaved people are loading these ships that they've essentially picked the cotton. They the ones that cut down the lumber. So it was all a system that was well known throughout the world. I just found that fascinating because, you know, growing up in Mobile, being from Mobile, you know, right, that shipbuilding is a very important industry. But the way the book was written really is the way you wrote the book and the way that you kind of tie the international aspect to Clotilda, but specifically to Mobile, was very fascinating to me. Another thing that was fascinating to me was ship graveyards. Had no idea that those things existed. You talk about kind of how you even, I think it was in the Carolinas that there was another ship graveyard, but kind of just for the context, for the people to understand, what is a ship graveyard, and kind of in Mobile's context, can you describe the ship graveyard of where Clotilda lies?
By all means. Before I do that, though, let me just quickly add one final footnote on the maritime story.
Yes.
We wanted to lay all of that out because there's a point to be made. A lot of attention's been paid on Clotilda's final voyage. What we wanted to stress in this book is that Clotilda, from birth to death,
yes, and we were going to get, and I
integral.
was going to get to that as well. I
Yeah.
wanted to get some of these because to your point, and we're gonna. I wanted to get to that. I was going to that, but you did an excellent job of literally pointing out Clotilda's trips and what they were used for, and some of the unknown cargo that was a part of those trips. And so I was leading to that.
So then let's hold that thought. I'm sorry to have injected that. I didn't want to lose it, but I should have remembered that you are good and that you would come to that point. So
absolutely,
ship graveyards. Anybody that's ever driven along a road and looked over and there's a junkyard with a bunch of old cars, that's the modern equivalent of a ship graveyard. If a ship doesn't sink out there on the high seas, if it doesn't get broken up for scrap, and a lot of them didn't, ship graveyards were a convenient place to just park them and let them be. Generally in a backwater, every port has one. And I knew about ship graveyards because I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there were a couple ship graveyards, and some of my earliest projects were looking at things that looked very much like one BA 694 coming out of the mud at low tide. And so, yes, I mean, early on, back in the 1970s and early 80s, I was looking at ship graveyards. When I was going to graduate school in North Carolina, there were ship graveyards outside of Wilmington. There are ship graveyards outside of Greenville and other places. Up Trainer's Creek, I remember looking at a tiny little centerboard schooner, probably built about the same time as Clotilda, that just no longer needed, worn out. Well, what do you do with it? So they just let it sit there until it fell away.
So these ship graveyards essentially are places where they would take ships and set them, just leave them, right? Or
you'd strip them. You'd get
strip them.
You're not going to leave an anchor. You're not going to leave a windlass or something valuable like that. But think about it. What a perfect place to hide the commission of your crime than in what was already likely evolving as a ship graveyard in that little backwater of the bayou.
Exactly, and that's the point I was going to get to. They knew exactly that this area where we would eventually confirm the identity of Clotilda was in this ship graveyard area where a number of other ships had been essentially left to die or to lay in the waters. In the case of Clotilda, how many ships were in that area that you recall? Do you recall?
Well,
that ship graveyard?
We found evidence of at least 14, but there's others that we did not see. There's stuff that's deeper in the mud, potentially older vessels that just sank down and got covered over time. So it's hard to say how many. We can trace it back to roughly the 1840s when there's a wreck in the area, but this is the kind of activity that generally doesn't get written down. The only reason we have records for some of them is that the government selected that as the first spot to start parking ships after World War II, as they were selling some off to be scrapped and others to get laid up further up the river at Bay Minette as the mothball fleet. So government keeps records. So that we have better records on, like the Lake Ellijay and other ships, the Tusitala, for example. But earlier ones, no. So there it is. I mean, sitting in a ship graveyard, coming back to a point right from the start, looking at the landscape and trying to think as somebody who works on the water and has sailed ships, including ships of that type. The sense was that it had to be more or less in the right area. While 1BA 694 was not it, and was, a vessel that actually was 3 times longer, much bigger than Clotilda, and built out of West Coast wood with modern steel in it. Um, just looking at where Foster had said on the account, where the transfer had happened, and looking at it, the easiest thing, if you've got a tug that's pushing you along and you're without your crew and you're Foster, is as fast as you can get around the bend of the river straight up. And so, again, coming back to this is the only area that has not been surveyed, the sense was, I bet it's right up there. So a number of us all sat around the first and second day after looking at the site. You know, the Park Service guys, Dave Conlon,
Mm-hmm.
you know, myself, the AHC, Ben Raines, all of us were sitting there
Mm-hmm.
talking about it. And I said, yeah, I think it's straight up there. This is the last area. Showed everybody our notebook with all the survey areas that had been done. Said, I think this is the logical spot. And I said, and look here, there's wrecks that are charted on the old charts. And it was said, well, that's just all old barges. And I said, that may be, but there's more to that than this. And where there's, no pun intended, smoke, there's fire. This has to be the focus. This is where we need to look, because my guess is that it's hiding in plain sight. And interestingly enough, I mean, we were walking those banks because it was a real low water period, and we passed that marker that had the mayor name on it. And Kamal Siddiqui turned to me and he said, how much you want to bet? It's right here. And I didn't take that bet because it was right there.
The other thing that stood out to me before we jump into actual Clotilda's involvement from cradle to grave to the transatlantic and I think the institution of slavery, as you all put it, this idea of, I didn't know this, and this was something else I learned in the book, was how it was big business and taking these ships that were made of steel and stripping them of all of their metal and that sort of thing, and reusing the steel. I thought that was fascinating. Again, there's fascinating information. And it was another huge business down in the Mobile area as well.
Well, interestingly enough, Jim, also another one where you have investors from afar getting somebody local to create a company, hiring it, and these guys out of the Great Lakes are paying to have these ships cut up and scrapped, and just a handful of them. And I don't think it really worked out that well, because there's a fair amount of some of those ships still in the river. Lake Ellijay looks like it sank practically right before they got started scrapping it. And it's only, you know, like 100 feet away from Clotilda. Tusitala cut down to a certain point.
That's Lake Ellijay. That's the one that's right next to Clotilda.
Yes, and that's got its own fascinating story that comes right back full circle to what we've been talking about all along, and that is the racism and the theft of labor and the disproportionate ways in which people are dealt with. I mean, because that ship, having been built in World War I, doing a little bit of trade, getting into a fire, getting stripped and turned into basically a floating barge, is then used in its last bit of life as a training platform for port battalions in New Orleans, including African-American regiments of port battalions, where these guys go out into combat, unloading ships at D-Day and then the invasion beaches of Japan without the benefit of more than a rifle, without a lot of support, and being, you know, do this work. All part of that campaign that was famously talked about, you know, the double V for victory at home against racism, victory abroad against fascism.
Absolutely. So, and the book did a good job of including pictures. That particular Lake Ellijay and that particular story, actually, there's a picture on page 74 of the book that shows exactly what you're talking about, which I thought, again, was fascinating. Let's talk about Clotilda.
Yeah.
You mentioned it. There are just some things that personally interest me from my readings. I hope we talk about the port of Apalachicola, Florida, as part of this conversation. But let's talk about Clotilda. I think it was built in 1855. But from its conception, as you all write in the book, from cradle to grave, Clotilda was actively tied to the institution of slavery.
Yes.
Let's talk about that. And you all did an excellent job. You touched on this, but there were a number of ports that you all would document as part of your research and outline in the book, from ports in New Orleans, this port here in Florida, from Mexico. There were a number of different ports that Clotilda visited, some of them where they documented the cargo and some of them where they did not. I'm going to turn it over to you for you to kind of just educate this audience on Clotilda's conception from building it, and if you could just share with this audience its involvement in the institution of slavery.
Well, coming back to when we were doing all the forensic work, we had to go back and look at the records of every documented schooner in the Gulf of Mexico, over 1,000 of them, from that entire portion of, from the early 19th century up through the time of the Civil War. Clotilda was one of several that stood out as being bigger, not necessarily bigger in terms of length, but bigger in terms of what it could carry. And that was an interesting thought. And these vessels also that were built bigger were owned by a couple of folks with ties to New York and having them insured, which one doesn't usually do, and also people who had a very distinct tie, in a couple of cases, like Timothy Mayer, to the expansion of the institution. Mayer had funded filibustering expeditions to turn the Hispanic, Caribbean, particularly in the Gulf area, into an extension of the American system with chattel slavery. He had also been complicit, as we could see, in advancing the cause of an ongoing trade in human beings. And to that end, we can't say more than we suspect, but the sense we have is that the ship was built the way it was to do exactly what it did on the final voyage. And as Emma Roach noted in her book, at the turn of the century, the locals said this wasn't the only time. And we have what we think is an interesting trail and a potential smoking gun with that voyage that has no cargo listed, but an unlisted cargo just the same, consigned to notorious slave traders in New Orleans. The slave traders who would turn around within a few months and take another vessel, paint it, put another name on the back of it, and send it directly Africa to take people against their will and illegally to the United States to sell them. That's a pretty interesting coincidence. So again, whether you come back to the point that Clotilda was built by people who used enslaved labor to build that vessel, who used enslaved labor to at times sail that vessel, who used that labor to load and unload that vessel, and who used that vessel, interestingly, to go to a number of ports, all of which had documented ties to the illegal trade because of the proximity to Cuba. Whether it's the Florida ports or all the way over to Matamoros, this is where people would go into these backwaters, into these bayous, and take people that had been brought over.
And you mentioned whether it was the Florida ports or where is that port located? That's
Matamoros is in Mexico.
Mexico,
and,
correct.
And it's just down south a little bit on the curve of the Gulf, just past the Texas border. But you've got Bayou Teche, you've got the Rio Brazos.
And they visited that port a number of times.
Yes, and that's also, interestingly, the port that Foster said he was going to go to, clean the ship up and repaint it with a new name.
Yes.
So that means there were active co-conspirators there in Matamoros. Yes. So with this, I mean, again, what we wanted to do is inject. There are excellent books, brilliant books that have been written. Natalie Robertson's and Sylviane Diouf's, the latest edition of Casula's, reminiscences, by Zora Neale Hurston. All of that tells an important story. What we could do to add to it was to say, this is how the maritime aspects fit into it, and add a little bit more to the understanding.
And this is what you wrote in the book. Clotilda, with its large size and full form hull, was intended to carry bulk cargo such as locally produced lumber, although built with a greater depth of hold. And it also had shallow draft that allowed it to navigate in and out of notoriously shallow Mobile Bay, using its centerboard to engage in an open ocean voyage. Thus, Clotilda was able to enter shallow ports in Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and Mexico. The vessel appears to be custom-built, atypical schooner. Both Clotilda's physical characteristics and her career supports this depiction.
Yes. So again, I mean, when the call came saying, what can you do to help? When I volunteered the company to come and do all of this, the thought was, I mean, my emphasis in my study has been the 19th century. 19th century ships in the maritime world. What both of my degrees were focused on, that's what I wrote about in them. So while people often, will talk about Titanic or World War II ships or some of the other stuff, or the archaeology of the atomic bomb, the heart of my scholarship is in that period and in those types of ships. So what I wanted to do from the start as we did this was, do the forensic archaeological work, but also in that to provide this context, this maritime context, to fill in part of the story that also, I think, pretty, in its own way, the facts don't lie. It ties Clotilda in beyond that final voyage. It's a far more criminal enterprise than I think some people with a casual look would think.
Then there is more to it than just the final voyage. This was an institution, as you all state. What is there one particular, other than the final voyage, from your research, is there one particular voyage that stood out to you that you could share with this audience of Clotilda?
As we said in the book, there certainly are lots of people being landed on the beach in Apalachicola and things of that sort. But the Louisiana bayous, as well as coming in and out of Galveston. Galveston had been an illegal port from the start, and I think most Americans don't think of James Bowie in any other way other than the Alamo, as opposed to the notorious slave trader he was, working with the Lafitte brothers. Clotilda went to all those ports, but it's that trip into and in and around, the Louisiana bayou that then goes with a manifest of unlisted cargo, but sent over to New Orleans to these notorious slave traders, that really got our attention. Sometimes it's not what is said, it's what's not said. And so with that, again, it was, I think my sense is, stepping out of a little bit of the purely academic role, that if I could go back in time and have a good hard look, that would be one where I suspect we would find definite evidence of captives on Clotilda coming in. But
you also talk about how they would trade lumber for sugar in Cuba, and how perhaps seeing the enslaved folk getting off of the ships from Africa to Cuba, seeing these enslaved folk load the ships, that also could have been an incentive for Captain Foster and Timothy Merritt to pay for their own voyage to West Africa. Can you just even talk about what was taking place in Cuba at the time, and Clotilda traveling over there?
When various nations decided that the slave trade needed to be made illegal, Cuba remained an open wound to fighting, the slave trade, because it was the Mecca for a number of these slave traders, many of them Spanish, because Cuba was a Spanish colony. But they had many co-conspirators, a large number of Americans, British, and others. Vessels would sail there. The British would have, and we would have patrolled the coast looking to intercept And an interception on the high seas, because the trade's illegal, is enforcing the law. But once people landed in Cuba, which had its own slave economy, then there was nothing the other folks could do other than, as we talk about in the book, the complaints, particularly from the British about this. The American government really did nothing because it was just as complicit at that stage as anybody else. So certainly Foster and the others knew that, and they knew exactly what was going on, and they knew the status of that illegal trade. Everybody on the waterfront and the entire Gulf Coast knew it. And so it made it very easy. It was convenient. But also, let's not forget that a ship taking lumber harvested by the theft of labor lands, is unloaded with labor being stolen from the enslaved there, and then it's loaded with boxes made again through that labor, with cane cut and processed using that labor, and loaded again using that labor. At every step, Clotilda is part of a criminal system. And people, I think, don't realize how intricately woven into the maritime world, but also into the entire fabric of the American and the global economy. Again, this is just one place where that, again, it emerges. I mean, you can see it there. And with that, again, the immensity of the crime globally,
Absolutely,
as it is practiced locally, comes across.
Absolutely. And I'm not going to get into the final voyage. We've discussed that several times on different podcasts. However, I do want to fast forward for the sake of time to modern day.
Yeah.
And a few things stood out to me. I thought the last chapter was the best chapter in the book. Very well written. I learned some new information, such as so you talked about there being documents at the History Museum of Mobile that have been sitting there, which is baffling to me, but that's just information that's there. But also, you all mentioned pieces of the wreck were pulled out of the hole and scattered on the bank. And you mentioned that on, I believe it was page 166 or somewhere around that time.
Yes.
What do we know about that, and what do we think that was? And so, if you could just frame for those that haven't read the book yet, but kind of what you all were sharing with the group about how there were actual pieces of Clotilda. Someone had went down and went into the hole of Clotilda and scattered some of the findings onto the bank.
Yes. Well, one of the things we found early on when we started diving the wreck was that, in addition to any damage that had come from trees drifting down and hitting it through the years, or a barge strike, there was definite evidence of what really looked to us to be underwater blasting. The way timbers were sticking out in a porcupine kind of way. If a barge hits something, it flattens it. If a tree hits something, it pokes it or may splay a timber. It doesn't create upthrust fingers sticking out of the mud with shattered timbers with some relatively fresh breaks. And by relatively fresh, I mean just given the level of colonization by marine organisms or the eating on that by those organisms, some of this stuff is only decades old at best. So clearly somebody had been in there. At the time all the diving is going on, there were
what time are you thinking that you all are, what's the conclusion of when do you think someone might have been into Clotilda?
Anywhere from the 1970s up through the 1990s. And indeed, there are some very interesting papers that Jack Friend was given copies of that are in his files in the History Museum of Mobile. I saw them, Nick Tabor saw them, a number of folks saw them, that said, hey, this salvage diver from Pensacola is in there. He entered, he swam in, he's seen this, he's seen that, couldn't see the copper. There were other stories about, blasting it to get the copper out. It comes back to what we've always said. I mean, you look at where that wreck is, you look at what had happened to it before we all got there as the detectives. there were folks who knew exactly where it was and what it was. And some folks had impacted that wreck, blasting and
So what
pulling
we
things
just
up.
for the sake of this audience, what we're saying is that somewhere between 1970 and 1990, someone
Or some persons.
or some persons dived into Clotilda, specifically even went into the hold
Yes.
and perhaps pulled out items from the hold and laid them out on the bank of the river.
Or pulled them out as they were trying to get to the copper or scrap it. The copper sheathing has been pulled off in the visible areas of the hull. As far as we could excavate, somebody had to do that. So
do we know what they might have pulled out or what they might have taken?
people talked about getting things out from inside the hold. People talked about, in one case, getting an anvil, which would make sense. Somebody talked
What?
just with
Getting a
an
what?
anvil for that a smith would use.
Okay.
Certainly the sheathing, the copper sheathing that protected the hull that had been put on specifically for the voyage to Africa. A fair amount of that had been stripped off, but the blasting inside had come at a certain point, and the center board itself had been dislodged and thrown up or pulled out. Potentially, I think somebody was just trying to maybe get to scrap, or who knows? I mean, all we know is this one guy saying, "I got in and I did this," in this memo that is being relayed to one of the mayors by the other, to just what people were saying in the background. It was interesting.
You mentioned Jack Friend, just for the sake of this audience. Who is Jack Friend and kind of his role in all of this?
Jack Friend was a local attorney, but also a historian who studied 19th century Mobile and is best known for his interest in the Civil War and the Battle of Mobile Bay. But Jack, using his own funds, launched surveys and searches for shipwrecks, and that included a series of searches for Clotilda, hiring professional archaeologists from Pan American consultants to do so. And their systematic, thorough surveys cleared a lot of areas in terms of not here, not here, not here. Jack is no longer with us. He died nearly about a decade ago. I knew him. A number of us did. He had a strong interest in seeing what lay beneath the waters of Mobile Bay, like Clive Cussler as well, and others who had gone in and done these surveys, but also the Army Corps of Engineers funding a lot of work by different groups to thoroughly map Mobile Bay's extensive underwater archaeological record, but very few had gone up the rivers. Jack's team found the scuttled Confederate ironclads Tuscaloosa and Huntsville, in the river, and found other, potential wrecks of the 19th, early 20th century, but they hadn't gotten to this point, that spot in the river where 1 BA 704 Clotilda is. But Jack's work really was one of the strong bases of understanding the submerged archaeological record of the Mobile area.
What's as we wrap up, like I mentioned, I thought the last chapter was by far for me because it really kind of gives me some new insight specifically into the survivors and that sort of thing, and to what they would experience, and as well as some of the modern day what had been captured and is available at History Museum. If you were to close out today's conversation about the book, and what do you want those readers to take away from this book?
I think there are 3 important messages with the book. First and foremost, it's all about people. We study things to say more about people, and oftentimes things give us insights that speak to what has not been said or what has been said incorrectly. So the process of archaeology and forensics, certainly it helped do that, and the book lays all of that out. But in that, the second point is, as we'd said earlier, that to just look at Clotilda within the context of the final voyage misses the point of the larger crime and the larger set of activities, not only in that vessel's career, but in the entire Gulf and in the entire country. And finally, coming back to it, the thought that sitting in there is this very unique site that deserves a great deal of thought and care in moving forward with whatever may happen with it, because this is, while it's damaged, the most intact known ship involved in the transatlantic slave trade through all of those centuries and all of those voyages. And not only is it known, and it's ostensibly the last known, it is so intact as an archaeological site that there is definite evidence of that voyage. There's definite evidence of what was done to turn that ship into a floating prison for the captives. We've seen and pointed out the bulkheads that were built in after the vessel was built to confine that space. And as we said at the time too, people know now that we found evidence, even despite the fire, of the upright posts that supported the platforms upon which the ancestors were, stacked inhumanely by Foster and his crew in the commission of the crime and in the voyage. So that uniqueness as a site, the power of that site and how people feel about it, those are all the things that I think need to be taken into consideration in terms of what moves forward. The people who have the voice here, the people who need to make the decision are, of course, the community itself. This is not something for, we can advise and we can give the hard scientific facts about this approach or that approach and the rest, and we will be doing that soon based on the most recent, really hard science work with, a lot of scientists and 400 pages, which is now going through peer review. But ultimately this, I think people need to, have is, with all the information before them, they make it, the decisions made that reflects what the will of the community and the descendants is.
Absolutely. We're going to wrap up here. Before I close out, where would you rank this finding compared to your other works that you've done? Where does this rank?
It's been 45 years, and I have worked on iconic and powerful shipwrecks that make you cry. This is this is profound. It's deeply upsetting, as it should be. And I've been upset before, on the deck of Titanic or swimming over the Arizona and things like that. And in those cases, connected with people tied to those events, both descendants as well as those that lived through it in the case of the Arizona. This site, if this was the last wreck I worked on, is one that I would feel that this is where in my career, I needed it needed the scientific approach. It needed me to come in towards the end of my career, probably, because only with age and time and understanding, ultimately, from my younger archaeological sense where I'd enthuse over finding a piece of a ship, to where now I'm moved and powerfully educated by contacts and context with people. This is
well said.
Yeah, it's overwhelming, actually.
Yeah, well said. We're at time, but just to the audience, this was an opportunity just to whet your appetite. As I mentioned, I learned a lot from reading this particular book. They talk about the Echo ship and how they purchased 450 captives were on that ship, and the warships would capture it, but those guys, those captains, would be found innocent, not guilty. So it gives you that story. It talks about how the survivors of Clotilda were how they were stacked and kind of what they experienced. So definitely recommending you purchase the book. Thank you, Jim, for your time. And I hope everyone has the opportunity to go out and purchase the book. Thank you. Have a great day.